Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this episode of Spreadsheet Gaming. In this episode, we're going to create a character. We are going to put the encounter table into our sheet, and we are going to add a combat tracker. And then last but not least, in that combat tracker, we're going to make a list and then filter all that data out for us. First things first, let's go ahead and bring up the book and see what we have to do to make a character. The first step says to put a 50, 40, and 30 into primary stats. For this character, I'm going to go ahead and make a warrior. So we'll do 50 in strength, 40 in dex, and 30 in intelligence. For the next step of building our character, we need to pick a hero path, and we've already done that. I mentioned we were going to go ahead and be a warrior. So let me go ahead and plug that in. We'll also go ahead and give ourselves a name. We'll call ourselves Hardock. And while we're here, we'll go ahead and put our race in as well. We're human. Now I want to add a few touches like the skills and the stat adjustments that I have for my race and class. So let's go ahead and plug those in. And then when we get done with that, we're going to go ahead and add a star to the strength. And then we will go ahead and add the race and class skills as well. And then when we get finished with that, there are 2 random skills that we get to pick. So I went ahead with locks and traps. I figured those are the most useful skills when running in these dungeons. That brings us to the next step in character creation, which is picking our equipment. So we're going to roll randomly once on the weapon table and 3 times on the armor table. But before we do that, we've got to set ourselves up a dice roller. So first, I'm going to plug in the dice numbers in one column. For this one, I'm going to do 6, 10, and 100. Now, the formula is ran between 1, and then you select the cell. But I am going to move this in just a moment because I want to add a modifier column. And so I'm going to show you the finished formula on your screen now. But if you want to add any modifiers, plus or minus, you go ahead and plug them into that column. The ran between formula is what's known as volatile, and what that means is any time a change is made on the sheet, it is going to update those numbers every single time. In other words, you cannot roll a die and then save the result. What you'll need to do is copy that number and then paste the value somewhere else if you need to keep that number, or you can just type it in, obviously. One of the nice things about this setup that we did is that we can go ahead and copy this and paste it and add it to any other sheet that we have. So essentially we could have a dice roller on every single tab if we wanted to. Now in this part you see me rolling up the random equipment that I get my hands on. I end up getting a mail coif, scale mail gloves, a war scythe, and a buckler shield that just has to go into my backpack because that war scythe takes 2 hands. So we'll go ahead and set up that backpack. I'm going to move the dice roller out of the way and then set myself up a few columns. This is going to be for the equipment that can be damaged. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy what I have on the main sheet, paste it here, and then here I'm going to add an extra column over to the left and then set up a sequence formula, because our damaged equipment can only be 1 through 10. So just to really quickly generate that list, I did sequence 10. And then to make a nice clear line, we're going to set up a border here at the bottom. I'm going to bold the header row. And then I want to go ahead and center the numbers because I'm not a huge fan of them kind of being sideways. And then we finish off by adding the buckler shield along with its stats. And I'm adding checkboxes here so that I can track damage. In case I move equipment back and forth, we can track the damage here. And then the next step in building our character is adding oil, picks, and food. So we'll go ahead and make a tab for that. One for the equipment and one for all the gear we can grab. And here I'm going to add a column for item, type, and quantity. I'm going to add filters to this later so that I can sort it and filter it however I need to. And once we get the oils, picks, and food added, the next step is plugging in the last few details. So we're going to do HP, rep, life, and fate. That finishes our character. The next thing I want to do is get the encounters into our sheet. Now there's a few different ways that we can get this done. The easiest way is this website, PDF to Excel, or at least that's the method I chose for this. I may do a remaster of this series in the future where I actually use Excel. It has something called Power Query that lets you get all the data out of PDFs, no problem. But for this one, it's really just as easy as dropping in the file. For this one, I dropped in the book of tables and game sheets that's available for D100 Dungeon. And ultimately what this is going to do is it's going to generate an Excel file, and we're going to be able to open that Excel file in Google Sheets. Up at the top, we'll click on File. We'll go to Open. We need to click on Upload, and then we need to upload the file that we did just get. And notice here it is telling us to create a new spreadsheet. I recommend doing that, and then we'll just copy the data and move it over to the new sheet as needed. And as you can see here, guys, it did rip out the most of the data. It's not very clean, but for the most part, we're going to be able to extract the data that we need and plug it into the encounter section. Some of the issues with the data includes these HP sections. You can see here we've got some dates in here. That comes out of like 336 or 776, and Sheets will read that as a date. We are going to have to fix that, but we'll fix that in another video. So now I'll make a new tab. We'll go ahead and paste the data that we have, and I'll do Control, Shift, and V for that. And for the most part, we did get the data that we need. Now, notice we do have the ranges on the left-hand side. Google Sheets isn't going to like seeing those. We are going to have to split this up, and the easiest way for us to do that is with the split formula. So we're going to insert a couple columns here to set up the columns we'll need for the split. And I'm going to call it low and high. That way we have the low number and then the high number. We'll start with the split formula. We'll pick the text, which is the cell over. And then we will pick the delimiter, which in this case is the dash symbol. And then the next part is optional. We don't need to do this for this particular formula, but the next part you can split it each time you see the delimiter. Again, not necessary for this one. Now we'll go ahead and get the rest of the monsters. And once that's done, we'll finish that split formula on down, and we've got everything we need for the encounter table. For the next part of this video, we're going to move on to the combat track. Nice thing about Sheets is we're going to be able to basically make an infinite combat track if we need it. So I'm going to start by making a new tab. Then we'll go ahead and copy the information from our encounter table onto our combat tracker because it's exactly the same thing. And in the first column, we do have the encounter name. Now the next step is I want to make a list here. I want to basically create a drop-down list and force whoever's on here, or force myself, to pick a monster that matches. Now, first thing I want to do to make it easier on myself is I'm going to turn this into an actual table. And I do that by hitting Control, Alt, and T. And then up at the top left, I can rename the table. I'm going to go ahead and call it Encounter A because this is the Encounter A table. Now I'm going to be able to reference this table in the drop-down that we're going to create. So I'm going to come back to the data validation section. You do that by clicking on data and then going down. I'm going to select drop-down from a range. And then there's two ways to do this. I could literally have typed this out, but I'm going to do the easier method, quote unquote, and just kind of drag and drop. And notice here that once I highlighted that whole area, it did automatically rename that section to Encounter A, Monster Encounter. And now we want to set up our filter formula so that we can get all the information into our combat tracker. I'm going to start by making us an extra column over here. And then we'll get started with the filter formula. I am going to have to make some extra helper columns once I get this formula finished. And the most efficient way for us to do that is to say that the range we're filtering is the Encounter A table we just made. And then the criterion is that we're checking the Encounter A table under Monster Encountered, and it has to equal cell B2. And as we drag that down, it is going to continue filtering all that information for us. Now we'll clean up some of that information by adding extra columns over there. We'll move our filter formula over to the side so that it fills up the information. And then we'll hide the columns afterwards of all that extra information we don't need. Next thing I want to do to keep track of the number of monsters I slay, I'm going to go ahead and create another column on to our left. I'm going to do my favorite sequence formula, except this time I'm going to add a little trick. I gave it a multiplier of 10, and that generated a number all the way down to 320. Now once I get the combat tracker properly laid out, I'm going to copy it, go all the way down to my list, and paste it all the way up. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the monster list, copy and paste it all the way down. Then I had to unhide the filter columns just so I could copy it all the way down to the bottom of our list. Hide them again when we're done, and give it a little test. As you can see here, I'm just plugging in random monsters throughout our table, so we know we're good to go. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, that is going to do it for this episode of Spreadsheet Gaming. I'll see you guys next time.